The summer I met Evelyn Carter. The asphalt outside exit 41 looked like it was trying to melt right off the highway, and I swear the air itself felt heavy enough to push a man to his knees. I'd been driving 18-wheelers for almost a decade by then, so I'd seen people pass out from heat before, but I'd never forgotten the day I almost became one of them. Back then, I was 24, broke enough that $2 in my wallet actually mattered, running a refrigerated load from Tennessee down into South Georgia, trying to make a delivery on time because being late meant losing a bonus I desperately needed. My mother had been lying unconscious in a hospital for almost 3 weeks after a stroke. The bills kept stacking higher than I could count, and every mile I drove felt like another reminder that life could kick a man while he was already flat on the ground. My truck's air conditioner had given up sometime before noon. The dashboard thermometer climbed past 114 degrees, and by the time I spotted a tiny fruit stand sitting under a faded blue tarp beside the highway, I honestly wasn't sure whether I was seeing peaches or just another heat mirage. The stand looked so small it almost disappeared against the endless fields behind it. Nothing fancy, just rough wooden boards, handwritten price signs, and baskets filled with peaches that somehow still looked fresh despite the brutal sun. Behind the counter stood a woman who couldn't have been much over 60, wearing an old straw hat with the edges falling apart and work gloves that had clearly survived more seasons than most pickup trucks. She looked tired, the kind of tired that settles into your bones instead of your face. But when she noticed me stumbling across the gravel parking lot, she didn't see another customer. She looked at me the way mothers look at children who pretend they're fine when everybody knows they're not. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the last 2 wrinkled dollar bills I had, and tried to smile. "Ma'am," I said, my voice cracking from dehydration, "can I just get 1 peach?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked past my face, studying the sweat dripping off my chin, the way I leaned against the counter to stay standing, the tremble in my hands that I couldn't hide anymore. Then she quietly pushed my money back across the wooden counter. "Honey," she said, "if all you've got left is $2, you're gonna need it a whole lot more than I do." Before I could argue, she grabbed an entire wooden basket, filled it with peaches, added 2 apples, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and reached into an old cooler for the coldest bottle of water she had. I stared at the food like she had just handed me a suitcase full of gold. "Ma'am, I can't pay for all this," she smiled. Not the polite kind people fake for strangers, but the warm smile of someone who had decided long ago that kindness was cheaper than regret. "No," she answered softly, "but one day maybe somebody else will need you more than you need that money." I tried handing the cash back again, almost embarrassed by how desperate I looked, but she shook her head before I could finish. "Sit over there," she said, pointing toward the only patch of shade beside the stand. 10 minutes. If you get back behind that wheel looking like this, you'll never make it home." Something in the way she said home caught my attention. She didn't ask where I lived. She didn't ask where I was headed. Somehow she understood that home wasn't just a place. It was someone waiting for you to get there. While I sat there eating the sweetest peach I'd ever tasted, she opened a small weathered notebook she'd kept tucked beneath the counter. She asked my name, wrote down Ethan Brooks in careful handwriting, then closed the notebook before I could see anything else inside. "What's that for?" I asked. She chuckled quietly. "That's my list of promises." I frowned. "I don't understand." She tapped the cover with one finger. "You don't owe me today. You pay me back when life finally decides to be fair to you, not one day sooner." Before I could answer, a sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly across the highway and stopped directly in front of the fruit stand. The deputy inside didn't look surprised to see her. In fact, he smiled, but there wasn't a single friendly thing about it. He climbed out, adjusted his sunglasses, and walked toward us with the slow confidence of a man who enjoyed making other people uncomfortable. Evelyn's smile disappeared, though she never looked afraid. She simply sighed under her breath like she'd seen this exact scene play out far too many times before. "Well," she whispered almost to herself, "looks like Richard found another reason to ruin somebody's afternoon." Richard Holloway stopped in front of the stand, removed his sunglasses with theatrical slowness, and looked around as though he were inspecting the scene of a crime instead of a roadside fruit stand. "Morning, Miss Carter," he said, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "Looks like business is good today." Evelyn folded her hands together and answered without giving him the satisfaction of looking nervous. "Morning, Sheriff." He glanced at the basket sitting beside me, then at the bottle of water in my hand. "Giving away inventory again?" She shrugged. helping somebody who needed it. He laughed once through his nose. Funny thing about helping people, sometimes it violates county regulations. My stomach tightened before he even reached for the citation book hanging from his belt. I was still young enough to believe that law enforcement always had a reason for what they did. I stood up, trying to explain that she hadn't sold me anything. Sir, she actually refused my money. He cut me off with one raised finger. Didn't ask you. Then he scribbled across the citation pad without another word, tore the page free, and slapped it onto the wooden counter. $500. Selling agricultural products without a current temporary roadside permit. Evelyn didn't even read it. She simply signed where he pointed, folded the paper once, and tucked it into the same notebook where she'd written my name. That bothered me more than the ticket itself. It wasn't anger. It was routine. Like she'd accepted that this was simply another Tuesday. Ma'am, I whispered after Holloway walked back toward his cruiser. I'll pay it. She smiled gently. No, sweetheart. But this happened because of me. No, she replied. It happened because some people forget what power is supposed to be for. Before I climbed back into my truck, she reached through the open window and squeezed my shoulder. Drive home. I nodded. My mom's still in the hospital. She looked straight into my eyes and quietly said, then don't waste another minute standing here talking to me. I drove away with tears I blamed on the heat because admitting otherwise would have been too much. The next morning my phone rang before sunrise. My younger sister could barely get the words out through her crying. Mom woke up. Those 3 words changed everything. I made it to the hospital just before lunch, and when my mother smiled at me for the first time in weeks, all I could think about was the old woman beside the highway telling me to go home. If I pushed myself another 12 hours that day instead of stopping, if I'd fallen asleep behind the wheel, I wouldn't have been there. Life moved on the way it always does. I finished deliveries, paid off debts one paycheck at a time, visited my mother every weekend until she could walk again, and eventually built the career I dreamed about. Still, every now and then I'd think about Evelyn Carter and wonder whether that little fruit stand was still there. 12 years passed faster than I care to admit. I got married. My mother met her grandkids. I left long-haul trucking and joined the Georgia State Patrol, mostly because I wanted to become the kind of officer people were relieved to see instead of afraid of. Funny how one act of kindness can quietly redirect a life without either person realizing it. I worked every assignment they gave me, never looked for shortcuts, and eventually earned a promotion into internal affairs. Most people hear those words and imagine politics, paperwork, and officers investigating officers. They're not wrong, but sometimes the job puts you on a road you never expected to travel again. Mine started with an anonymous complaint buried inside a stack of reports. It looked ordinary at first. Multiple roadside produce vendors claiming years of harassment from one county sheriff, excessive citations, selective enforcement, confiscated merchandise, suspicious tax assessments, cases dismissed once they reached court because paperwork mysteriously disappeared. There was one name that kept resurfacing over and over, Richard Holloway. I almost ignored it. Small county disputes usually stayed local. Then one photograph fell out of the file. It showed a weathered fruit stand beneath a faded blue tarp. My heart nearly stopped. I knew that stand before I read the address. I remembered the taste of that peach. I remembered the notebook. I remembered $2. I quietly requested the investigation. Nobody else understood why I suddenly became so interested in a forgotten county complaint. For 3 weeks, my team dug through 12 years of records. What we found made every one of us sick. Holloway hadn't been protecting the county. He'd been slowly suffocating people who couldn't afford lawyers, farmers, elderly vendors, retired couples selling vegetables to supplement Social Security. Every time someone refused to sell land to one of Holloway's business associates, inspections increased. Citations multiplied. Permit renewals mysteriously stalled. Tax assessments climbed without explanation. Most eventually gave up and sold their property below market value. It wasn't one bad decision. It was a business model disguised as law enforcement. Evelyn's name appeared more than anyone else's. 6 official citations, 2 forced demolitions of temporary structures, thousands in legal fees, property tax penalties the county accountant couldn't explain. She'd appealed every single one and somehow lost almost every time. The deeper we dug, the uglier it became. One retired clerk finally admitted she'd been pressured into altering filing dates. A former deputy confessed Holloway routinely ordered officers to make life uncomfortable for anyone who refused to cooperate. Another investigator uncovered financial records connecting Holloway's brother-in-law to several real estate purchases surrounding Exit 41. They wanted Evelyn's land. It wasn't the fruit stand. It wasn't the peaches. A development company had quietly planned a truck stop and travel plaza near the interstate for years. Her little piece of property happened to sit exactly where the entrance road needed to go. She refused every offer because it was the last place she'd shared with her late husband. So Holloway decided that if he couldn't buy it, he'd pressure her until she couldn't afford to keep it. The final blow came from the county tax office. Evelyn had 30 days left before foreclosure proceedings would begin. 12 years of pressure had almost accomplished what greed couldn't buy outright. I remember sitting alone in my office that night holding the copy of the first citation she'd ever received. $500. The same day she'd handed a complete stranger her last basket of peaches. I kept thinking about how different my life would have been if she'd chosen profit instead of compassion. My mother might have died without seeing me again. My children might never have been born. Every promotion I'd earned traced back to 10 quiet minutes beneath a faded tarp beside the interstate. People like to believe life changes during huge dramatic moments. But sometimes it changes because an exhausted widow refuses to take your last $2. That's when I drove home, opened an old storage box, and searched through things I hadn't touched in years. At the bottom was a dried peach pit wrapped inside a napkin I'd forgotten I'd saved. My wife looked at me like I'd lost my mind until I told her the story I'd never fully shared with anyone. She listened without interrupting, then simply said, "You already know what you have to do." She was right. We didn't just need another investigation. We needed every piece of evidence strong enough that Holloway would never wear a badge again. Over the next several days, warrants were signed, financial records subpoenaed, body camera archives recovered, dispatch recordings restored, and witnesses placed under protection. Every missing puzzle piece suddenly found its place. By the time spring arrived, we weren't preparing to question Richard Holloway anymore. We were preparing to arrest him in front of the very woman he'd spent 12 years trying to break. The morning we rolled into Exit 41 felt strangely familiar, almost like the highway itself had been waiting all those years for the story to come full circle. 5 Georgia State Patrol cruisers blocked traffic in both directions while our investigators parked behind them. And within minutes, truck drivers were standing outside their rigs holding up cell phones, trying to figure out what could possibly be happening at a little roadside fruit stand. Evelyn was arranging peaches into wooden baskets just like she'd done every summer before. She looked older, of course, her hair almost completely silver now, her hands a little slower, but there was still something steady about her that time hadn't managed to wear away. When I stepped out of the SUV wearing my dress uniform, she smiled politely the way small-town people smile at strangers, not recognizing me for a second. I walked to the counter without saying a word, reached into my pocket, and laid 2 worn $1 bills on the wood between us. Then I carefully placed a small glass display case beside them. Inside rested a dried peach pit wrapped in the same faded napkin I'd kept for 12 years. Her eyes moved from the money to the peach pit, then finally to my face. I watched recognition slowly replace confusion, followed almost instantly by tears she couldn't hold back anymore. "You made it home," she whispered. I smiled, though my own voice nearly disappeared. "Yes, ma'am, I did. My mother lived another 11 years because you stopped me from getting back behind that wheel." Before she could answer, Richard Holloway's patrol truck pulled into the gravel lot. He climbed out wearing the same smug expression I'd remembered from that afternoon long ago. But this time it vanished the second he noticed our vehicles, our investigators, and the cameras recording everything. "Captain Brooks," he said, trying to sound confident. "What's all this about?" I looked at him for several seconds before answering. 12 years. He frowned. "Excuse me, that's how long you've been using this badge to terrorize people who couldn't fight back." He laughed, but nobody else did. One of our investigators stepped forward carrying a thick evidence binder while another read the warrant aloud. "Fraud. Official misconduct, extortion under color of law, tampering with government records, conspiracy involving illegal property acquisition." With every charge, his face lost a little more color. "This is political," he snapped. "You don't know who you're dealing with." I couldn't help smiling at that because I'd heard almost those exact words from bullies my entire career. "Actually," I replied quietly, "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. The question is, do you remember who she is?" I nodded toward Evelyn. Holloway glanced at her for only a moment before looking back at me. and that tiny hesitation told me everything. To him, she had never been a person. She'd been an obstacle, a stubborn old widow standing in the way of a profitable land deal. 2 investigators removed his badge, while another officer secured his sidearm. He looked around as if somebody might rescue him, but all he found were dozens of truck drivers silently watching from both sides of the highway. The same people he'd ignored for years were now witnesses to the moment his authority disappeared, as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Evelyn never celebrated. She never insulted him. She simply lowered her eyes and quietly said, "I hope one day you learn the difference between being feared and being respected." Those words hit harder than any sentence a judge would eventually hand down. After Holloway was driven away, I turned back toward the fruit stand. "Ma'am," I said, raising my voice just enough for every officer nearby to hear, "today I'm finally paying back a debt that's been overdue for 12 years. Then I looked at my team. "Buy every peach she's got." They laughed, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. "Every basket," I repeated, "triple the asking price." Within minutes, every piece of fruit on those tables had been sold. Some officers paid 4 times the price. A few truck drivers joined in after hearing the story. One elderly couple purchased empty baskets just because they wanted Evelyn to keep the money. She stood there shaking her head, overwhelmed by kindness she'd never expected to see return. Before we left, I asked if she still had the little notebook. She disappeared into the stand for a moment before bringing it back. Its cover faded and corners worn smooth by years of use. She opened it to a page near the front. My name was still there exactly as she'd written it that blistering afternoon. Ethan Brooks. Beside it, she'd written one simple sentence: "Paid when life became fair." I looked up at her and smiled. "I don't think life ever becomes fair." She smiled back. "Maybe not. But people still get to choose whether they make it a little better." I've thought about those words more times than I can count because she's right. Justice isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it takes 12 years. Sometimes good people lose almost everything before truth finally catches up. But I've also learned that kindness has a memory far longer than cruelty does. A sheriff can spend years abusing power, and people will eventually forget his name. A widow can hand an exhausted stranger her last box of peaches, and 12 years later that single act can come back wearing a captain's badge. So now I want to ask you something. If you had been in Evelyn's shoes, with bills piling up and your own future hanging by a thread, would you have given away your last basket of peaches to a complete stranger? Or would you have kept the $2 because survival had to come first? There isn't an easy answer, and that's exactly why I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your opinion in the comments. Tell me whether you believe justice finally won, or whether it simply arrived far too late. And if this story reminded you that even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's entire life, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes good people never get rewarded. Sometimes they do. It just takes longer than anyone expects.